And there were 25 consecutive snowstorms. Do you remember reading that?
Yeah.
And the snow was up so high that when they shoveled it, they said it was up 12 feet. And they had to make walkways. So you can imagine what a bad morale time it was, and a very low point for the Americans. And at that point, they were ready for a turning point. They really didn't think there would be one.
They needed help.
They really needed help, yeah, because the continental currency was worthless at that time.
The phrase "not worth a continental."
Yeah. So they had no money. They had no clothing. Practically, uniforms were non-existent. And they'd been fighting for 6 years, almost 6 years at that point. So you can imagine, the British were still #1 on land and sea, and the Americans were trying to make a debut on the stage,
That's
I might
right.
say. But they really had no idea whether they could make it or not, and I don't think Washington knew that for quite a while. But he was willing to take that chance, which I think is wonderful, and that's what created the atmosphere for a turning point to happen.
So you'd say that his arrival and the arrival of the French troops kept a lot of the people in the war?
Yes, it did, yeah. Well, that kind of started after Saratoga. Saratoga was a major win for the Americans, and that's what brought in the Dutch and the French. And that then encouraged the Americans, this was earlier on, it was just a few years before that, and they were encouraged at that point that they could actually make it. But look how long it took from Saratoga to Yorktown.
Why would you say that it took so long for the actual intervention to work, or to really come to pass?
Well, it was a series of events that had to happen. It's like one of these things that only military men know how to handle, I guess. And that is, things can't all of a sudden happen like they would like it to happen. Therefore, they had to wait for certain events to happen. In other words, they needed more money, they needed ships, and they needed more men. And those things kind of all had to come into play before it would actually look like it might work.
Right.
And that all, if you check it out in the book, it took a long time. And working together, with Washington and Rochambeau, that was another whole thing that had to take time, and it couldn't just happen quickly.
And so, how would you say that Rochambeau's background, his historic background, prepared him for the fight in America?
Well, he started out at the age of 16 in the French army. He had just changed from a direction toward the priesthood. His older brother was going to become the military man in the family to carry on the aegis for the family. But do you remember what happened to his older brother?
He died.
Yeah. Therefore, his younger brother, Rochambeau, whom we call Rochambeau, was actually hauled out of the seminary he was in and then sent into war. So he had from 16 until 55 to prepare himself militarily all over Europe.
I read that actually the seminary he was in, they thought he was a very good student, but he was leaning towards a different kind of sect of Christianity, one that they didn't have. And so, when around the time his brother died, he left because he was almost not fitting in with the teachings that they had at the seminary.
Well, I don't know how he really felt about that. I don't think we know that. That was what his father and some other family members thought.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he probably would have been fine in the seminary if his older brother hadn't died, I imagine. But it's hard to even guess those things because, it didn't happen. Maybe he would have wanted to join his brother in the military, and maybe his father would have said, no, you have to become a priest.
Right.
In those days, parents told kids what to do and they did it.
And that's
When
You'd
does
like
that
that.
happen these days? We like that. That's a good plan. Sometimes people forget who's the parent and who's the kid. I'm a grandparent now, I can say those things.
So I read that it was sort of like the social dynamic at the time in France. If you were from nobility, which Rochambeau was, and you had two sons, you would give one to God and one to your country. And why is it that they would take him out of his years of religion training for a career in military?
Because they had such a long history in their family of military men making their mark. And this would be their only chance, because it was a small family. It's not as though they had 7 or 8 kids. And one of them, if he loved the priesthood, could stay there. But no. I mean, if you visit the chateau, you can see there are vestiges of ancient military men and their exploits all over the walls. And I've looked at some old pictures, actually, of before I was there, that show even more stuff on the walls than they have now. So, I mean, it's just ingrained in them. And I would say that Rochambeau moved into it quite easily.
So would you say that that the Rochambeau family is one of the more prominent military families in France?
Yes, and I mean, they were prominent before, but not as prominent as they were after Rochambeau came to America.
And did they continue that military tradition throughout even modern times?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. His son came with them, remember?
Played a big part, yeah.
Came here, played a big part. And do you remember what his son did after his father left America?
I don't recall. I remember that he went actually left his father in America to go request more troops and more aid from the French.
Right, he did that.
Came back sort of empty-handed.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
But he ended up getting the naval fleet, which worked out really well.
That's right. That all worked out for him. But afterward, he did not go home with his father, and most of the troops did not go back to France immediately. They went down to the Caribbean. And young Donatien, well, he didn't have such a good time down there. It didn't work out so well for him. I would really like to write another book that takes all the key participants at the back of the book. Remember that list?
Mm-hmm.
About 60 guys and a few women. I'd like to really finish their stories, or do maybe 40 of them. And Donatien had pluses and minuses in the rest of his life. But then when he was captured by the British, and he was in a British jail. And then he was released many years later, and his father had actually become ill. And then I'm trying to remember exactly what happened. Anyway, he was back in Europe and he was still fighting. And he died in the Battle of Leipzig, which was after his father died. He couldn't even be home when his father was dying.
That's really too
So,
bad.
yes, they've continued, not today so much,
Mm-hmm.
but certainly into the 1800s.
And could you just describe the relationship that Rochambeau himself had with the Americans and the military leaders on the American side?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can give you a general overview on that. Rochambeau had the perfect personality to do this job, so therefore he got along well with the Americans. And maybe you can remember what he did when he arrived in Newport that made the Newporters fall in love with him.
He really tried to stay away from their personal lives. He didn't want to impact them very much.
That's right, exactly. And he did something else that impacted them in a very positive way. When he got there, Newport was not in good shape because the British had occupied Newport for quite a while. And they had left some months earlier. And that's why Rochambeau could actually find harbor there, safe harbor. But the houses had been, I don't know what shape they were all in, but they were in pretty bad shape. And some of the houses were not habitable anymore when Rochambeau got there. And so this is one reason that'll probably come into one of your other questions. The Americans weren't that excited to see the French. There were a couple of reasons why not. And one was that the British had just been there and occupied them. They didn't want another group of people coming in doing, they didn't know what. So they were very reticent. But what Rochambeau did, which I thought was very, very smart, he made a plan and offered it to the Newporters. And that was that if they would agree, he and his men would refit all the houses that they needed to billet their officers for the winter. And then when they left, when the French would leave, of course at that time they had no idea when they would be leaving,
Right.
they could have been there for 2 years, who knows. But the plan was that then they would give the houses back to the Newporters. Do you remember that?
Hmm.
And then they loved him after that.
He really
I mean, who
ingratiated
wouldn't?
he ingratiated himself
He
to the
did.
Newporters.
He really did, yeah. So, you know, they were reticent when the French harbored there, but they soon grew to trust him and see that they weren't trying to just occupy the area or take over land. Or that's the amazing thing about the French in this particular instance. I mean, to have another country coming into your country with 5,000 troops and not wanting to actually take over land or fight for themselves is pretty unusual. I don't
Well,
think people realize that today.
I read that Rochambeau took even smaller measures to kind of ingratiate himself to the Newporters. He really tried to stay out of their way, and then when they did cross paths, it was always very nice and cordial, and the Newporters really loved them, and that even some soldiers married Newport girls.
Yeah, and they had parties.
Hmm.
They had to be careful because they didn't want to create any problems with the girls in town. But wherever they went, you know, there was good sociability between the soldiers, mostly the officers, and the local gentry, you might say.
And of course, when the cavalry started to act out, he sent them to Lebanon
Yeah.
with that kind of flimsy excuse of cheaper food
Yeah.
for the king.
Well, they probably needed to go somewhere anyway because probably Newport could not have maintained all those extra people with horses and everything too. It was hard enough finding horses for everybody.